First class of this third semester. I don't know what we call it. Third run, third session, whatever we call these. Not a big class tonight, but I was only going to keep it short because it's just going to be an introductory to what we're sort of going to do. I think I just wanted to start out by saying once again, my sort of mindset behind these is just sort of to try to both teach myself and teach you guys sort of just to learn your beliefs, like know what you believe and know how to talk to people. And I've sort of discovered over the last 2 years and now this year, as I'm like researching and reading and learning, it's like the more I learn, like the more I don't know. I don't know anything. Like, I really don't know anything. It's just, you think you learn something new and then it opens up this whole new world of things you don't know. And, this isn't my thought, but I can't remember who said it, but somebody said like, the instant you think you have all the answers about something, you've actually lost any answers you may have had. And, I sort of want to reiterate that, like just sort of be humble when you're talking to people, you're learning what you believe for yourself, and this class is for you, but it's also to like engage other people, be able to talk to other people, and, be very humble. And Jordan Peterson, who Sean talks about a lot when he's up here and he speaks on Sundays, Sean Olson, he said like sort of the most important thing is not to be right. Like, you might think even in yourself, it's like, oh, I just want to know. I want to be right in what I believe. So the most important thing is to pay attention. Like paying attention to someone is the most important thing. And I realized too in my own life, and you might be able to relate to this, like when I'm talking to somebody and they're like, even if it's serious or not serious, and they're sort of talking to me, and I'm like listening, but then they'll say something that triggers something in my head, and then I can't wait till it's my turn to talk, and then I stop listening. Like you're not actually listening. Yes, and I'm thinking about Dave a lot, but I'm the same way. Like, especially in a conversation where it's a bunch of like, John can relate to this in hockey, like when it's just a lot of jokes going around. Like somebody will say a joke and it's like, I can't wait till it's my joke. It's like, wait, my joke's gonna be so funny. I don't care about that guy's joke. So, and I started to be self-aware about that, or try to be, and I realized when someone's talking, like, yes, I may hear something that they're saying that's important, but then that might trigger something, and then I kind of stop listening for a little bit, and I'm just like, oh, I'm gonna say this to them. Where it's just like, no, just try to pay attention. Pay attention to what people are saying. And hopefully, like, this helps. Oh, we got someone else here. So I'm not, if anything you take in from this class, that's the most important lesson. So you don't have to come anymore. So I want to just do a little review. If you've come to these classes or if you've not come to these classes, this is, like I said, the third one. So the first year we did was sort of arguments for the existence of God. These were classical philosophical arguments. So I sort of gave an introduction to philosophy, how these arguments work. They were the argument from contingency, which is sort of like everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. I'm not going to go in depth on any of these. The second was the cosmological argument, which is just the causal argument, like things have causes. And then the third argument was the moral argument, which is that objective moral values like don't exist unless God exists. So that was like the first year. Then we went from that to the second year, which was like the attributes of God class. I remember we went through all the divine attributes, God's like omnipotence, omnipresence, his omnipotence, his immutability, his being eternal, his being self-existent. And we talked about him being holy, and then like his loving nature. And then that ended with sort of a doctrinal study of the Trinity. So, you may remember that if you were here, we sort of examined the Trinity biblically and then also what that sort of means philosophically. So the third class is going to sort of take parts of both of those classes and sort of incorporate them. I don't really quite have a name for this class. I called the first one like God's existence, and then the second one of like who is God or attributes of God. This one could be all about creation, argumentation, the doctrine of creation, and then creation and evolution, because that's like a big debate that we still have. If you notice, I don't call it creation versus evolution, so you can talk about that when we get to it. Saving the evolution part of this class till the end, so sorry to disappoint, but I don't want to get kicked out of the church too soon. So how we're going to do it is, it's funny, the big struggle for me was like how I wanted to lay this class out this year, because we sort of have 3 distinct things I want to talk about. I'm trying to figure out the best way to approach it. So the way I think I'm going to do it is we're going to go back to argumentation, and I'm going to give you another classical argument for God's existence that comes from sort of the creation side. You might call it the design side. It is not, you may have heard about what's called intelligent design theory. This is not that. We can talk about that if people have questions about it. But that's not sort of what this argument is. Then I'm going to go through a biblical doctrine of creation, just like I did with the doctrines last year of God's properties and his attributes. And then we will have probably what everyone really wants to hear is the creation and evolution discussion at the end. So you have to stick around to get to that. And I mean, I think the big thing for me and what I want people to know is I want people to sort of really, really have a deeper understanding of what the Bible actually says about creation, like how the Bible, lays it out for us and what that sort of means in, this era of modern science and how to interpret that. So I sort of wanted to do something a little different. We don't have a big crowd, so this might not actually happen. Does anybody have any questions about sort of things that might be covered in this class? Like if you have something that, I really wanted to hear about this, and then know if I'm going to cover it, or maybe I'll write it down and then I can address it.
My question, Ben, is are you bringing your point of view, or are you going to bring several points of view about the topics you discuss?
Several points of view.
Okay.
So like when we get to sort of the creation evolution discussion, I'm going to talk about you have what's called young earth creation, you have theistic evolution, you have like atheistic evolution. So I'm going to try to give a fair presentation of all of the different views, and then also how they relate to the doctrinal, what the Bible says about creation. Like, are they compatible, are they not compatible? That's basically how I'm going to do it.
Great.
And then at the end, if people want to know where I fall, I can tell you right now, I don't really know. I don't have a definitive answer. Like I said in the beginning, I don't know. I'm trying to keep an open mind. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Does anybody else have sort of a question about what's going to be discussed in this class, or anything they would like to learn about? Like, sometimes I'll open it up to questions and someone will ask me a question. I'll be like, actually, I don't know. So I want to sort of be prepared in the future.
I know, sorry. So Ben, why do you think when someone hears a certain point of view that they get so hard-nosed on it? Like some people they just will not see another point of view once they have one.
I mean, this is a big, you're talking about, this could go into psychology here too. I think a big part of it is is that I like to say that people that get offended, it's because they aren't confident in their own views. And one thing I say is know what you believe. It's like the more you know about what you believe, the less likely I think you are to get offended when someone sort of says something that attacks what you believe, and it's sort of, I think, a big thing for me growing up. It's just these people I trusted just told me this is how the world works. And then when I got challenged with that, my defense for it was well, no, this is what my dad told me. So it's the more you sort of have an understanding, because you're basically, it shatters someone's worldview, and we sort of define ourselves a lot by our worldview. How we think about the world is very defining to who we are as people. So I think people sort of no, this has to be right, or else who am I as a person? So I think that's a part of it. Like I said, there's more psychological aspects to it too, how someone was raised and sort of what was instilled in them on children and stuff.
And then that often leads to church divisions, because people will build a doctrine around that. They'll want everybody to believe that way.
Yes.
But this class isn't actually about that.
No.
This class is so that you can hear points of views and decide on one for yourself.
Absolutely. Like, I'm not, when I say like, oh, the doctrine of creation, I'm sort of giving a broad view and an in-depth view of like the doctrine of creation. And this oftentimes my sources come from all different sort of churches. I'll pull from sort of Catholic doctrine, Methodist doctrine, and just sort of what these experts and these scholars in all of these, like throughout history, have sort of learned from the Bible and sort of said, like, this is sort of what this doctrine means. This is sort of what the Bible is saying. And if you remember last year, I talked about sort of the web of doctrine, and sort of there's this expanding web. And then on the outside of the web, you have doctrines that don't really matter to the structure of the web, and it's sort of the center. And we didn't really write out what they were, but I would say, like, Jesus Christ is sort of at the center, and belief in Christ, and he is the Son of God, and he dies for our sins. And then it expands, and sometimes people get hung up on these doctrines that don't matter, and they sort of define their whole Christian walk by something, and there's a story of this guy who is, and again, I think I told last year, who is a very outspoken atheist now, and he was, raised in, I think, the Catholic Church, or, no, not Catholic, but he was ordained, went to theology school, and he got so hung up on what's called like the inerrancy of the Bible, like that the Bible is without error, like, and when he was studying the biblical history, he came up with two different translations, like from Mark, and he went to his professor, and his professor was like, well, we don't really know, Mark could have meant this, or maybe that's just a bad translation. And this actually shattered his view, like, and then he actually became an atheist because he's like, oh, the Bible is, and it's just like, no, it's like this was written 2,000 years ago. We don't know exactly. And the way I was talking to David too, the way I feel about like biblical inerrancy is that the Bible is true in what it's teaching, like the moral teachings and then the truth that it's teaching. Sometimes, all the people's names might not be exactly at what their names were because, it's been lost in translation. But what does that mean for your walk? Like if Methuselah's name was spelled a little differently in reality than it's spelled now, like, stuff like that doesn't matter.
Are you ever going to deal with like women in the church and the way they function in anything that you?
People ask me about it, I can. I'll write that down. When we talk about creation, I will be talking about the creation of humans and, man and woman. So, that's something that will come up in the doctrine of creation and sort of like the literature and how we interpret the literature. And I'll get to this, but there is sort of the two, sort of when we read Genesis, there's like the two creation stories. There's like the 7-day, and then when you get to the next one, it sort of describes it more loosely, like talks about like how God created man and woman like equally and in his own image and blah, blah, blah. The tidbit is that the first chapter of Genesis and the second chapter are two different sources. And the second chapter is actually older than the first, as to our best evidence. I'm not saying like we compare, like people often think that like Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. We don't actually know that. And if he did, he actually pulled from, they have 4 sources that I think he pulled from, and he maybe put them all together. And if he did write it, but we're not sure if he wrote it. So again, we'll talk about stuff like that when it comes up. And I think people pick and choose what they take literally, and that can be a problem. So if you get hung up on one verse, it's like, how does that compare to the other verses, the other things? I think the Bible is a beautiful narrative that was written over thousands of years that is still coherent. And so it's like you can't always just take one thing and build this like monument onto this one thing without acknowledging what else is there. So thanks for all the questions, Linda. This is good because with not as many people here, I don't know if I want to dive right into like what I was going to start with, but we can. Anybody other than Linda have any questions? Yes, that's what, and we're doing a review, so I want to talk about that.
So I can't remember what attribute you called it, but I struggled with, I felt like you were kind of saying that God doesn't change his mind or something about that.
So that was God's immutability.
Okay.
And we did talk about this, I remember. outside of the class, and you described it in a way that I kind of liked. But when I talked about God doesn't change intrinsically, but he changes extrinsically. So the way I describe it is like God's essential nature does not change, but because he interacts with us and we change, like God then changes extrinsically. So he changes in how he is dealing with us because we're changing. You sort of talked about it like God, we are created in God's image, and so God does sort of experience emotions like we do in a certain way. I know that's hard to conceive of, and that it's not that God's sort of necessarily changing, it's just an expression of his like anger at people not being righteous. And I had never thought of it that way, and I kind of like that description. That it's not that maybe God is actually sort of changing his mind, it's more that he's just changing in how he's dealing with people.
So if the Bible, because I get hung up because, like I just showed John this verse, maybe in Exodus. So God literally, in the Bible, it literally says God changed his mind because he was so angry with the people for making the calf and worshiping it, and being impatient for Moses to come back down. And God literally says to Moses, and this is the story, so maybe it's just like an embellished story, but I tend to not see it that way. It's like God says to Moses, dude, go away because I'm so angry, I'm going to kill everyone. Just get out of here. Like why would you say that unless you're so mad? Like they were friends. God and Moses were friends, and he's like, get out of my sight because I'm so angry, I'm going to kill everyone. And Moses is like talking to him like, you don't want to do that. You just saved all your people from Egypt. Okay, blah, blah, blah. He talks God like off the cliff almost. That's what it seems. That's what the story is kind of like. It's like, and then God is like, okay, for your sake, like I won't do that. And it says, so God changed his mind about, and I'm like, man, that sounds like he's just like this emotional character, but it's more like, you're saying it's more like it's written that way because that's how he responds to us, not because that's his nature.
There's a couple different ways I could answer that, and I guess I'll answer in all the ways that I'm thinking of it. But I think first and foremost, like God's unchanging nature, like in that scenario, it's like I think it's showing us like that. I think the message to get from that is that like sin has a consequence, and so the message is like God wants us to be righteous because sin destroys. It's not like God is like, oh, I'm mad. Like, yes, he's mad, but because of the destructive nature of sin. So, I look at the flood the same way, that like, look at what wickedness does. Wickedness like destroys, it washes you away. So in one sense, I think the message from that story is that. Like, I think that's the message to get, that like there are extreme consequences to us being wicked and our sin. I think another way to read it is that there is an aspect of you have to read it in the mindset that the people at that time might have had. These are ancient people, and ancient people of all walks, not just the Jews, like the gods were cruel. Like they just had this view of like anytime something bad happened, it was because the gods were judging them. So I think that there could be an aspect of whoever wrote that, like I said, I don't want to say it's Moses because we don't know, has come from this culture and this viewpoint of like, oh, God is very angry. God is very, like, these people have done something bad and God is incredibly angry. So I think that you can't then say it's, oh, just that or just this, but those things all have to be taken into like incorporation in that story. And, some of those, I don't think I talked about this last year, but there was, the Christian doctrine of like what we call inspiration. Like, so the Bible is divinely inspired by God. It's very different than the Muslim doctrine, which that is the dictated word of God. Like, so the Quran is actually like, those are God spoken words. Like, those are direct. So every word in the Quran like can't be wrong. The Bible is what's called divinely inspired, that God let people be themselves and write this book. And, one of the beliefs is that's why it took thousands of years for God to get it the way he wanted it, because, like, somebody would write one thing that he wanted, but then they would write something else that maybe he didn't want, So there is human voice, and every writer in the Bible is different. They write differently. Even Paul writes differently depending on who he's writing to. So there's a lot involved in there. And I'm not saying that, and you know, the literal interpretation could also be right. Like maybe God just was going to punish these people and he changed his mind because of the pleadings of, yeah, or he was testing Moses.
Ben, will you ever delve into like the end times or any of the doctrines
If
of
this
the
goes
end times, like the
like
mark of
another
the beast and
4 years, maybe. That would probably be the
I
last
have a
one I got
I
to.
have a personal interest in some of the end times.
It is on my
doctrines.
list, but it was probably going to be the last one I got to. But that, I mean, I will talk about that. Goes into what I was saying. Like the Bible is this narrative book written by all these different people, and it also, you know, there's this study of the Bible called hermeneutics, and that's it's not just of the Bible, it's of literature, and that's like where you study the type of literature something is. The thing about the Bible is it has like a numbers of different styles of literature. You know, so the book of Revelation is written in what's called apocalyptic literature. So it is very imagery laden, very symbolic. Then you have stuff that's written in sort of like poetry. Then you have stuff that's written in like personal prose. Then you have stuff that's written in like sort of a dictation. You have historical stuff. So it's like when you're reading certain parts of the Bible, there's people that have been studying this for a long time that say they examine it written as this type of literature, so you shouldn't interpret it as another type of literature. This is just in the style of writing, you know, and it's so that is something to consider when you're reading the book of Revelation. And there are other Jewish apocalyptic type writings that aren't part of the New Testament that you can read and see the comparison. What time is it? All right, so we'll keep going. Any other questions? I like these questions. Keep me from diving in. All right, so we'll move forward a little bit, I guess, to the difference is like if you were here the first year, I presented arguments sort of in a classical philosophical form. I'm not going to do that this time. Thought that was like we don't really need that as well. You don't need a philosophy class. This already is hard enough to wrap your head around. But I will have forms, like I said, so I'll have forms. But the first thing we're going to deal with is called the teleological argument. And this word teleological comes from the Greek word telos, which basically means purpose. But we come to understand it sort of as, you know, design. This is sort of an argument for a purpose behind the universe, or an argument for the design of the universe. We won't be talking about it in its classical form because it's changed a lot, but this goes back to sort of the time of Aristotle, Socrates. They were the ones who sort of used like that our universe has a purpose, a telos. You know, and what they did, they like even back then, you know, they marveled sort of at the order in nature. They marveled at nature. You know, they would go out and look at the night sky, and you know, they studied the stars because they didn't have anything else to do, and they didn't have lights. You know, like we live in a world that like lights hide the night sky a lot, and you know, they would see this sort of expanse of stars and just like they were like blown away by it. I mean, I think anybody will be like when you just sit on a starry night and look at the stars, it's just like it's amazing. Like every one of those is like, some of them are way bigger than our sun. And so like, I mean, so basically because of what they marveled at in nature, like, so Plato described it as like the universe, that there is a maker and a father of all, some great soul or some king who ordered the primordial chaos into rational cosmos. Plato himself said that, and Aristotle was the one who coined the term the uncaused first cause. Like I've said that before, that the universe must have an uncaused first cause that he called a divine intelligence. And it's funny because if you go back to, you read Paul, I'm not go back, go forward, you read Paul in Romans 1 when he talks about like God's invisible nature, his power, and his deity can be perceived in the world by like the creation. That like God can be seen. And these Greek philosophers who lived about 400 years before Paul, you know, they are examples of this. You know, they didn't even have knowledge of the Bible, and they could see this. And then, you know, basically we have sort of evidence of sort of belief in types of gods or religions dating back to what we think is like 40,000 years ago. You know, we have burial rituals where so people sort of were looking to the world and had religious thought. Like it's sort of this natural state. It's like philosophers call it a properly basic belief that like belief in God doesn't have to be taught. Belief in the divine. It's like you are exposed to the world, you'll see it. You'll have an experience with it, you know, and humans got it wrong for thousands of years, but they were like, you know, I look at ancient religions and sort of pagan religions, it's sort of like they're trying, you know, they're on the path, you know, they get it wrong or the enemy sort of steers them the wrong way. It's in us to seek the face of God. So that was then, this is now. So this argument has changed quite a bit. So sort of go back 150 years ago, I mean even before that with like sort of the age of the Enlightenment and the age of rationality and rational thought, which had like many good things. You know, there was, you know, Enlightenment was great in many ways, especially to take us out of the Dark Ages, but it sort of led to, I don't know what to call it, but people sort of fell in love with their own intelligence a little bit, you know, and that's something I'll give credit to the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church sort of like views that like the problem with intelligence is it views its own creation as the most important. I think that's sort of the problem with Satan too. Like Satan was too smart for his own good. He didn't care about the truth, he cared about his own intelligence. And so about 150 years ago, we sort of had this new way of looking at the world, and that, you know, the world, the universe and the earth were maybe a lot older than we had originally thought. So sort of scientists used to believe that, well, you know, given this stuff and enough time, like eventually life would just happen. You know, we'd just get lucky. Like with enough time, it just would happen. It was just by chance. Like how could human beings not arise given enough time? Like, right? However, science still, over the last 50 years, have sort of proven this assumption to be very wrong and made some discoveries that are like very opposite of this view, especially in the world of astronomy, cosmology, astrophysics, physics, that they've discovered that like the very initial conditions of the universe, when the universe first began, the beginning of time, that they had to be so incredibly precise and delicate that to even allow the possibility of life is just like the odds are incomprehensible. This goes back to the very beginning of the universe. You know, and science tells us if you want to say that 3.5 billion years ago things could have been slightly different, there would be no chance of life today. So the balance of these initial conditions is what is called the fine-tuning of the universe. That these numbers, these things I'm going to talk about, have to be so fine-tuned, that are so precise that it's like they're fine-tuned. And we don't mean that in a way as that like someone tuned them. It just means that like the numbers are so like the variables are so tight that if it was any different, like the universe wouldn't even exist. So these things are what are in this fine-tuning I'm going to talk about are in these things that we call constants in nature and sort of these arbitrary amounts. How do I spell that word? Yeah, that's right. Arbitrary quantities, not amounts, that are in the universe. So I'm actually not even going to talk about like the very laws of nature, the laws of physics that our universe operates on. That's another aspect. I mean, maybe I will eventually, but like why do the laws of nature even work the way they work? We're going to assume the laws of nature and actually just talk about different things that operate under our current laws and that they still need to be super precise. So what do I mean by constants? Like, so constants are, I'm not going to go through all of the list, but so the force of gravity. So when you're sort of looking at like the laws of physics, you're mathematically representing them, the force of gravity is always the same. Like it's this constant. Now it doesn't mean like, oh, why are you lighter on the moon? You know, that's because mass is different, the mass of the moon. So those things change, but the force of gravity is the same throughout the universe. So that's a constant. It is a constant that is not caused by any law of nature. There's not some physical law that creates this constant force of gravity. Another example of that is the subatomic force, the thing that holds molecules and atoms together. There's another force there that is constant. It's always the same. Again, there's no physical law that governs that. Now, we can, again, hypothetically imagine another universe that has the same exact laws of nature that our universe has, and those constants were different, and like the universe would be radically different. It would be a totally different kind of universe with the same physical laws that we have. Now, arbitrary quantities are a little bit harder to explain. It's sort of like there's these amounts of things that were just there, like in the beginning of the universe. One is, if you read anything about this stuff, you'll hear the word entropy. Again, it's sort of hard to explain. It's a very broad thing, but it's sort of the level or the amount of disorder in a given system. So, there was a set level of entropy in the universe at the beginning, and it didn't start at 0 and then go to a different number. So basically what it means is so if there's not enough disorder in a system, you can't have change. But if there's too much disorder, the change is too rapidly. So, let's say when you're talking about these beginning of the universe models, there was very light element, there was hydrogen and heat and, but if it was too much of the same, if there was too much balance, the universe never would have changed. It would have just stayed like this big pool of hydrogen forever. If it was too much, if there's too much disorder, everything would have changed too quickly, and basically the universe would have expanded and exploded and been gone. So that amount of entropy, there's no why it was that amount. There is no cause. There's no physical, natural cause of that. We don't know. There's no way to prove it was just there. So over the past 20 years or so, these scientists have discovered that these constants, like the force of gravity, the amount of entropy, those numbers are so incredibly precise, it's almost beyond comprehension. So that's what is meant by fine tuning. It's not that someone fine tuned them, it's that it just falls within this scale that is so tight that we call it fine tuning. So sometimes people will disagree with this because they'll say fine tuning implies you're basically assuming someone there is tuning something. So you're arguing in a circle, and that's not what we mean by fine-tuning. It's just a way of saying that, no, the number has to be so tight. It's not like the constant of gravity could be within this big range and we could still have life. It's not that at all. So, yeah, that's where this argument goes. I'm going to give you some examples of how fine-tuned this stuff is. So I'm going to throw some big numbers at you. I might only write one of the numbers on the board because the rest of them are too big. So let me give you, these numbers are just for control. So let's assume, for the sake of this argument, that the universe did begin about 13.5 billion years ago. So the number of seconds between then and now would be 10 to the 17th power. So that number is So that's how many seconds there have been in the universe. So if you could count 1 every second, you'd have to take you that long to count. Take you 30.5 billion years to count that number. The number of atoms in the universe, the number of known atoms in the universe is estimated to be 10 to the 80. So I'm not going to write that out. So that is 10 with 80 zeros after it. And that's the number of estimated number of atoms in the universe. Okay, keep those numbers in mind. If the force of gravity, or the subatomic force, were different by 1 part in 10 to 100, life could not exist in this universe. So another way of thinking of that is that if gravity was different by 100 zeros, 1%, life would not exist if the force of gravity was any different at all. The thing I talked about before, entropy, the level of entropy. Now, the odds that our universe began with, the level of entropy that it began with, which is what was needed for life to happen, the odds that it began with that level would be... So, I'm going to try to explain this number to you. So, I can't even begin to explain this number. It is incomprehensible. So you work from the right to the left. So it's not like, 10 times 123, so 10 to the 1,230. No, it's this number, so 10 with 123 zeros after it, and then you put that above this number, and it's that many zeros. So this 10 would have this many zeros after it. And that's just one thing. And so then what you'd have to do then to get the odds of life existing is you have to then multiply these numbers together, which is like an astronomical number. Like even these two just multiplied together would be... So the odds of both of these things happening is that. Like, and this is... They say that there are some probabilitist people that say if there's anything that's bigger than this number, odds, it's impossible. Like they say this is the minimum that it can be. That anything higher than this number is impossible. So and the thing is they can sort of test these things. They test these things like, these aren't just like people are making these up. They know the physical laws of nature, and so then they can change sort of the number of gravity, and then they've been able to figure out that like, oh, actually no. If you change gravity, anything outside of this, life can't exist. So, and again, and what they mean, finally I want to end with this, what they mean by life permitting doesn't mean this is the odds that we'll get to here we are now. This just means the odds of getting a universe that could support life. And it doesn't mean human life. What they mean by life is, I'll give you the scientific definition, is that an organism of any kind that is able to take in food, extract energy from it, grow, adapt to its environment, and reproduce in some way. That life. And that's just the odds to get that life, not even to human life. So, if you took away this, like, we're not even talking about life, we're talking about you don't even have, like, matter. Like, you don't have matter, you don't even have, like, chemistry. Like, these universes are so beyond, like, what we even have. Like, you couldn't even get to matter then to somehow get to create stars and then have star supernova to create planets where you could even have a chance of something evolving. So this sort of is what we're going to keep going with this argument, but this is what we're talking about with the teleological argument. This is like the fine-tuning of the universe. It's not this argument that pits like evolution against creation. It's a thing that says like, okay, you want to say that like life evolved? Well, how do we even get to the state where that's even possible to start happening? So that's what we're talking about here. Again, that's going to be it for tonight. That's the introduction. This one is 10 quadrillion vintigillion, I think. Is that one? I looked it up. I did look it up. I think you can just make them up.
My iPhone couldn't do that.
No, this one, yeah, your iPhone won't go this high. It'll get this one.
Give me an error. One of the things that's interesting about all that.
You're going to ask a question? Yeah, I forgot to open it up to questions or comments.
When we talk about the inerrancy of the Bible and all of that stuff, we don't even realize, like, the Great Lakes in our country contains 20% of the entire world's fresh water. And they were only made somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago, which is when we called the flood of Noah that we think that happened back then, which could have been simply caused by the Great Lakes being formed in one part of the world and causing a flooding in another part of the world.
Yeah.
So there's so much we don't know, and the people who wrote that didn't even know about the other half of the world because 1492, Columbus, was the only one that thought
Yeah.
the world was round.
500 years ago, they still
Yeah.
thought the Earth was flat. So,
Exactly.
yeah,
So
we'll get into that when we study the
good.
doctrine.
That'll be great. I can't wait to hear it.
You know, it's what they call the difference between exegesis and intragesis. And exegesis is when you read something and you try to take what the author meant and you sort of try to view things. Intragesis is when you take your own sort of interpretation and insert it into what they said. So I often say this a lot. Is like the Bible is not a science book. These guys are not scientists. They were doing the best that they could, and this was the world they understood. So like to look at the Bible and say try to prove scientific theories or disprove scientific theories is like you're reading the Bible wrong. I mean, we can gain insight. Like I think they both can work together, and we can gain insight about the world and about science. But to like base a scientific argument is just not the right way to read the Bible.
You said there were a certain amount of atoms in the world,
Universe.
in the universe?
Yeah.
In the universe. I didn't know that. So I'm thinking, does that change?
I mean, because matter doesn't, like, it changes to energy. Like, matter either becomes energy or becomes matter. But, like, they don't get, like, matter, in a closed system, matter doesn't get destroyed. So it either converts or created. It converts to energy. So that's what they're saying. In the universe, and our universe is, as best as we know, a closed system. It's expanding, but it's a closed system. So. So if you destroy an atom, atoms can be destroyed, like the hydrogen bomb, but it creates energy. So, yes, which will then be used to form different atoms.
I've never heard that the universe is a closed system. I thought it was infinite.
No.
How can there be an end to it? Is
Well,
there a wall someplace?
No, I mean, you can't. It's that it's outside of space, there is nothing. Like, so space, the universe also includes space. Like, empty space is part of the universe.
Yeah.
So, like, outside the universe, there is no physical space. There's nothing. That's, like, to the best of our
How
knowledge.
do we know that?
They can measure, like, they've measured the radiation and the light. We can sort of, like, measure the edge of the universe based on the radiation, like, levels. So they're able to measure the expansion rate of the universe. But it's not like a disk. There's no way to visualize it because you're trying to visualize physical space and then not physical space. It's not like, I say it expands like this, but we don't really know. It's just like physical space is sort of growing. But it's hard to, like, visualize it. There's
So
no
how could we be sure that beyond
I'll give you some books.
that there's no
I'll give
other
you some
planets or stars or whatever beyond that?
Well, I mean, there's no way to measure anything beyond physical space. So, like, I mean, like I said, there are smarter guys than me that know a lot more about that, dedicate their lives to stuff. I mean, it's hard to conceive of. But outside the universe is basically space and time and matter. Like, even when people describe nothing, like, the space in between galaxies is still space. Outside the universe, there isn't even space. Like, there's literally, like, said nothing as not even a thing. It's just nothing. We don't know. There is, like, to say, like, oh, you came to the edge of the universe and then there was this more space and then there was another universe. Well, no, like, because that would be physical space. That would be part of the universe.
The other thing I wanted what Dave was saying about the Great Lakes and all. My understanding is that at the time of Noah, that's when plate tectonics started and a continent started to be formed. So there was only one landmass. Like, it wasn't the North America over here and Africa over there. It was
I
all
forget
together.
the name of it, but yeah, Pangea. There is a lot more evidence now that there was originally, like, one large landmass and then they sort of split apart.
Right.
But it's not actually evidence for that hasn't actually really been discovered again recently. They used to think that it was just sort of like a myth, but now they're discovering that might actually have been true. I'll research into that and we can talk about that more.
Thank you.
I mean, you can just see where this would fit there, that would fit
All right. You got a question or are you good? All right, turn me off.